Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be talking about positional weaknesses in chess, and what we're going to be focusing on is what we call a weakness of like a particular color square. So like if you have a weakness on the light squares or if you have a weakness on the dark squares. So if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So we're going to be going over a relatively famous game today. It was in Fisher's My 60 Memorable Games. It was Robert Byrne versus Bobby Fischer. Robert had a brother named Donald Byrne, which is why I'm tongue-tied, and Fischer played another very famous game against Donald Byrne called the Game of the Century, which is we're not the game we're going over. We're going over the game that he played against Robert Byrne. So that game started with pawn to d4, and then we had knight to f6, and then we had pawn to c4, g6, g3, c6, bishop g2, d5, cd5, cd5, knight c3, bishop g7, pawn to e3, castles, knight on g to e2, knight c6, castles, and then we have b6, b3. So the position is relatively close to symmetrical, with one key difference being that black has not weakened his d6 square, but white has weakened his b3 square. So Fischer is starting to see the beginnings of what he feels could be a positional advantage here for black. He feels like positionally that d3 square is weak. Fischer has a light squared bishop that can occupy this diagonal and create problems, whereas white's light squared bishop isn't nearly as dangerous on the c1 square. So Fischer immediately starts trying to take advantage of this. He plays bishop to a6. Robert Byrne plays bishop to a3, which does not attack a weak square. Fischer plays rook to e8, and Fischer's already thinking about getting really aggressive in this position and trying to get his pieces to occupy that weak square on d3 before white gets a chance to do the same. And that's why after queen d2, he comes up with this super aggressive idea. He plays this move, pawn to e5. Now, of course, he could have played pawn to e6, and the position is just equal. Everybody would have a completely symmetrical position at that point, pawn structure-wise. But he decided he wanted to play e5 and risk isolating his own pawn just so that his knight would threaten to come to the d3 square because d3 is weak. And he had some other really aggressive ideas in mind here to take advantage of the fact that the d3 square is weak, and eventually he wants to turn that into all of like white's light squares being weak. He thinks is a possibility. So we have d takes e5, knight takes e5, just trying to occupy that weak square with a piece. You know, this is what we learned from Morphy. If you see a weak square, occupy it with a piece. So we have rook fd1, which turned out to be a mistake, and then we just have knight d3. He just occupies it with a piece, because that's what you're supposed to do. You have a weak square, we occupy it with a piece, right? And he has a really clever idea in mind here, because, you know, Robert Byrne thought, well, this is kind of a mistake. I'm going to play queen to c2, and okay, great, you're occupying this weak square with a piece, but what's the point? I'm double attacking that knight. I'm threatening to play rook takes d3. You're simply going to have to move that knight again, because nothing can hold it. I can't bring in extra ammunition. I can't bring in the queen to hold the knight. You're just holding it with a bishop. If I play rook takes knight, bishop takes, queen takes, that's two pieces for a rook. That's a better exchange for white than it is for black. But Fischer had something in mind here. He had something really cool in mind that would lead to white having completely, permanently weak light squares that he would not be able to defend. And it's easy enough to miss because at first it looks like this is just a material grab. He plays knight takes f2, which is part of this really insanely cool combination to dominate the game positionally. So he plays knight f2, king f2. It's part of this combo. He wants to play knight g4 check, king back to e3, knight takes e3. So this is simple enough to see. We've got a fork, right? We're attacking a queen, a rook, and a bishop. And you're thinking, well, the bishop isn't the most relevant part of that. You know, we're attacking two pieces that are bigger than the knight. So here, when the queen moves, obviously we're going to take pause the video and see if you can find it. If you're paying attention, we're not taking the rook, we're taking the bishop. Because the light squares in white's position are weak. After that bishop disappears, white has a weakness on every single light square. And more importantly, black has a lot of pieces, like this bishop and this queen and this rook, that can get to those light squares. So it's not enough that you have weaknesses on the light squares, you have to be able to get to them. In this case, white is both weak on the light squares, and black can get to those light squares, and as it turns out, White's position is just lost in a couple of moves because that king has nowhere to hide. The king has to live on these light squares. There's nowhere else where this king can go. So after king to g2, we have d4, blazing the trail to bring these pieces back to the longest light square diagonal on the board. It's beautiful. It makes me smile just looking at it. The bishop's going to come back to b7. The queen's going to go to d7. The queen's going to threaten to go to h3. We're going to be mating. Somehow, some way, we're going to be mating on these squares. And meanwhile, okay, the knight still has to find a square to go. Where are we going to move this thing? We either got to move the knight or we got to take this pawn. One of those two things has to happen. So he decided to take the pawn. He played knight d4, bishop b7 check, hitting that king, king f1, queen d7, resigns. Game over. Why does he resign? Like, he gives up. So this is the threat. This is covered. So the king can't escape this way. This is covered. So look at all the squares that are covered. We're covering all that. All that's covered. You see, there's not a lot left. All the light squares around the king are covered. There's two black squares that are not covered. But we're threatening to come in here with the queen. The queen is threatening to come into h3. So if queen h3 and all these other squares are covered, where are we moving our king to? King g1, we have bishop d4. So for example, let's say queen d7, right? Let's say we move a knight, like knight on b to d5 or something. Queen h3, king g1, bishop h6, game over. The queen would have to move, and then we have bishop e3 is going to be mating. If the queen moves to a square that allows queen g2 is mating. So you're going to have to move one of those things. When the knight was still on d4, and the bishop was back on g7, we were threatening to simply play queen h3, followed by bishop d4, followed by queen g7, queen g2 mate. So we had to meet that threat as well. So, I mean, you could try something like queen f2, right? And then queen h3 check, king to g1, and now simply rook e1 check. As cool as that move looks, is absolutely winning. The point is bishop d4 doesn't quite work yet, because rook takes d4. Rook e1 check wins on the spot. Rook e1 check, and the point being, if rook takes e1, bishop d4 wins, and of course, if queen takes e1, queen g2 is mate. So that's what happens when you have a weakness on a particular color square. Like in this case, it was a weakness, a small weakness on the light squares early in the opening. There was this small weakness on d3. What does Fischer do? Fischer says, I learned from Paul Morphy from 1858, from Morphy versus Anderson, weak squares need to be occupied with pieces. So Fischer immediately starts trying to occupy that square with a piece. He occupies that square with a piece, and then right as it looks like his position is not going to get any better, he says, wait a minute, I can get rid of that light squared bishop. I can sacrifice, get rid of that light squared bishop, and now all the light squares are weak. And I can fly in with my pieces and deliver mate just a few moves later. And that's how the game finished. So anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.